Some wars seem like they were written into the background of history itself. They weren't quick clashes or even drawn-out campaigns. They stretched across centuries, shaping cultures, languages, and even borders we still recognize today. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are the 25 longest wars that lasted for centuries. But before we begin, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, click that notification bell. I know we say it all the time, it truly helps the channel grow. Thank you guys so much. With that being said, let's get into it. The list, not a war. We're not going to war. 25. Reconquista. The Reconquista was less a single war and more a centuries-long project. Christian kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula gradually retaking land from Muslim rulers. It began after the Umayyad conquest of Spain in 711 and ended in 1492 when Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. This was the same year Columbus sailed west, so Spain's rise as a global power came directly out of this conclusion. For nearly 8 centuries, Iberia was a patchwork of Muslim and Christian realms, with alliances and betrayals crisscrossing religious lines. To think, someone living in the 800s might have heard of the war as a distant fight, while their descendants in the 1400s were still caught up in it. If there's ever been a slow burn in history, it's this. And this ending wasn't just military. It shaped Spanish culture, language, and even global exploration. 24. Roman-Persian Wars. The Roman-Persian Wars were basically the world's longest rivalry. Stretching over 700 years, Rome, and later its eastern half, Byzantium, were locked in endless showdowns with Persia. First, the Parthians, then the Sassanids. Neither one ever really crushed the other. Instead, the fighting turned into a cycle. Invasion, counter-invasion, truce, betrayal, repeat. This wasn't just about land, though plenty of provinces flipped back and forth. It was about prestige, trade routes, and the stubborn pride of two empires that hated to lose. Generals like Crassus met their humiliating ends here, and emperors marched east only to slog back home beaten. By the time the dust settled in 629, both empires were so exhausted that when the new power of Islam burst onto the scene, neither could hold back the tide. 7 centuries of rivalry ended not with victory, but with both sides bowing out to someone new. 23. Scottish-English Wars. While England was busy fighting France at times, it also had centuries of trouble with its northern neighbor, Scotland. Beginning in 1296 with Edward I's invasion, the Wars of Scottish Independence kicked off, bringing figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce into legend. But the fighting didn't stop after Bannockburn, or independence treaties. It simmered on for centuries. Border raids, pitched battles, and dynastic claims kept the two kingdoms locked in conflict until 1603, when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne and united the crowns. For over 300 years, life along the Anglo-Scottish border meant constant tension. Whole communities were shaped by the back-and-forth violence. The unification under one monarch didn't erase the past, but it finally paused one of the most enduring rivalries in the British Isles. 22. Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars. The Byzantines and the Bulgarians fought like neighbors who couldn't stop feuding over the fence line for nearly 7 centuries. Beginning in the late 7th century, the Bulgarian Empire emerged as a powerhouse north of Byzantium, and naturally the two butted heads. The wars swung back and forth. Sometimes the Byzantines smashed Bulgarian armies and took territory. Other times the Bulgarians stormed into Byzantine lands and embarrassed Constantinople. These conflicts weren't constant battles, but cycles of treaties, broken promises, and renewed warfare. They shaped the Balkans' politics and even pushed the Byzantines to reform their military strategies. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans were knocking on the region's door, and both empires had bigger problems than each other. Still, centuries of warfare had left scars, stories, and an uneasy legacy. 21. Byzantine-Arab Wars. When the armies of Islam exploded out of Arabia in the 7th century, the Byzantines were among the first major targets. What followed was over 5 centuries of clashes between Byzantium and the Arab caliphates. This wasn't just border skirmishing. It was massive sieges like the Arab attempts on Constantinople itself. Twice, in 674 and again in 717, the city held out against enormous Arab forces, thanks in part to the terrifying weapon known as Greek fire. The fighting stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Anatolia. While the front shifted constantly, neither side managed a knockout blow. Instead, it became a grinding stalemate. Over time, the Byzantines stabilized, and the Arabs turned inward with their own divisions. By the 12th century, the conflict had cooled, but for half a millennium, this rivalry defined the Eastern Mediterranean. Think of it as the long chess game of medieval empires. 20. Russo-Turkish Wars. Russia and the Ottoman Empire were like heavyweight boxers who kept scheduling rematches for 3.5 centuries. From 1568 to the end of World War I, they fought a staggering series of wars. The prize? Control of the Black Sea, the Balkans, and influence over Eastern Europe. Sometimes Russia gained. Sometimes the Ottomans struck back, but gradually the Ottomans lost ground. These wars shaped modern borders. Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece all gained independence thanks to this ongoing struggle. The Crimean War of the 1850s, one of the bloodiest episodes, even dragged in Britain and France. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing and Russia had undergone its own revolution. The rivalry ended not with a single climactic battle, but with both empires reshaped by modern history. Still, for centuries, whenever trouble flared between Europe and Asia, you could bet Russia and Turkey were in the thick of it. 19. Polish-Russian Wars. The history of Poland and Russia is like an old family grudge that's never healed. Between the late 15th century and the late 18th century, they fought repeatedly, sometimes over borders, sometimes over dynastic claims, and sometimes just because opportunity knocked. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was once a powerful state, stretching across much of Central and Eastern Europe, but Russia was rising, and the two were bound to clash. Wars saw cities like Moscow invaded by Polish forces, while later Russia struck back with devastating power. This rivalry eventually tilted in Russia's favor, especially as Poland weakened politically. By the end of the 18th century, Poland had been partitioned out of existence, carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. These wars didn't just redraw maps, they erased Poland as a state for more than a century. Few long wars ended as tragically for one side as this one did. 18. Ottoman-Persian Wars. When two powerful empires share a border, sparks usually fly. The Ottomans and the Persians proved this over 3 centuries of on and off wars. Their first major showdown came at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where Ottoman gunpowder weapons gave them a decisive edge. But Persia wasn't going anywhere. The wars that followed were fueled not only by politics, but also religion. Ottomans were Sunni Muslims, while Persians under the Safavids followed Shia Islam. That sectarian divide turned the conflict into more than a land grab. It was ideological. Control of places like Baghdad and the Caucasus shifted again and again. Neither side could completely overpower the other, though the Ottomans generally held the upper hand. By the early 19th century, the fight had burned out, leaving both sides exhausted. This long duel shaped the Middle East and cemented the Sunni-Shiite divide that still echoes today. 17. Ottoman-Habsburg Wars. Picture the Ottomans pushing into Europe while the mighty Habsburgs stood in their path. That was the reality for over 250 years of warfare between these two dynasties. The first big spark was the Battle of Mohács in 1526, where the Ottomans crushed Hungary and put themselves right on the Habsburgs' doorstep. What followed was centuries of sieges, counter-sieges, and constant tension across Central Europe. Vienna itself was besieged twice by the Ottomans, most famously in 1683 when a coalition of European forces finally broke their momentum. That battle is often marked as the turning point when Ottoman expansion into Europe was checked. From then on, the Habsburgs slowly pushed back. By 1791, the wars had run their course, but not before leaving scars across the Balkans and Hungary. This wasn't just a regional fight, it was a clash of civilizations at Europe's frontier. 16. Ottoman-Venetian Wars. Venice was a powerhouse of trade, and the Ottomans were an empire on the rise. Put them both in the same Mediterranean waters, and you've got nearly 3 centuries of wars. Starting in the 15th century, Venice fought to keep its lucrative trade routes and colonies safe from Ottoman expansion. The The battles ranged from epic naval clashes to long sieges on key islands like Crete and Cyprus. At times, Venice held its own. At others, the Ottomans steamrolled their defenses. The fall of Candia, modern Heraklion, after a 21-year siege, remains one of the longest in history. These wars marked the decline of Venice as a great power and the rise of Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Still, Venice wasn't entirely erased. It survived as a cultural and commercial hub long after losing its military edge. Few city-states punched so far above their weight for so long. 15. Anglo-Spanish Conflicts. England and Spain had a rocky relationship, and that's putting it mildly. From the late 1500s to the 1800s, they tangled in wars fueled by religion, trade, and colonial ambition. The Spanish Armada of 1588 is the most famous episode, where England's smaller fleet in stormy weather humiliated Spain's Grand Navy. But the conflict didn't end there. These two clashed across the Atlantic in the Caribbean, in Europe, and wherever their empires brushed shoulders. Sometimes England came out on top, sometimes Spain, but the back and forth wore on for more than 2 centuries. By the 1800s, Spain's power had waned, and England had become the world's premier naval force. What's striking about these conflicts is how global they were. They weren't just fighting over Europe, but over the New World too. This was a rivalry that helped shape the Age of Empires. 14. Polish-Ottoman Wars. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire were two giants of Eastern Europe, and for more than 2 centuries they butted heads. Their wars were messy, sprawling affairs across the borderlands of modern-day Ukraine and Moldova. Some of the most dramatic battles came during the 17th century, like the Battle of Kotin in 1621, where Polish and Allied forces held off a much larger Ottoman army. These wars were not constant, but they came in waves. Raids, sieges, and major campaigns. Both sides sometimes fought indirectly through vassals and Cossacks. The conflict finally ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which marked the decline of Ottoman expansion into Europe. For Poland, though, the wars left the Commonwealth weakened, setting the stage for its later partitions. 2 centuries of struggle over contested frontiers left scars and reshaped the balance of power in Eastern Europe. 13. The Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he set off nearly 2 centuries of holy wars between Christian Europe and the Muslim world. The Crusades weren't a single war, but a series of campaigns, some more organized than others. They led to dramatic moments, like the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 and its loss again under Saladin in 1187. Crusaders established kingdoms in the Levant, which hung on for generations before being slowly dismantled. By 1291, with the fall of Acre, the Crusaders were effectively gone from the Holy Land. But the crusading spirit didn't stop there. It bled into campaigns in Spain, the Baltic, and even against heretical Christian groups. For nearly 200 years, Europe's knights and kings answered the call of the cross, reshaping politics, trade, and religious relations. It was as much a cultural movement as it was a military conflict. 12. Arauco War. In South America, the Spanish Empire ran into the Mapuche people of Chile and found themselves in a war that dragged on for centuries. Starting in 1536, Spanish conquistadors tried to subjugate the Mapuche, but the resistance was fierce. The Mapuche knew their land, used guerrilla tactics, and refused to bow. Even as Spain expanded across much of the Americas, Chile remained stubbornly resistant. The conflict became known as the Arauco War, and it outlasted Spain itself. Even after Spanish colonial power collapsed in the early 1800s, the struggle continued with the new Chilean state. The Mapuche were eventually subdued in the late 19th century, but their defiance had already lasted more than 3 centuries. Few indigenous resistances anywhere in the world held out this long, making the Arauco War not just one of the longest wars, but one of the most determined struggles for survival. 11. Mughal Maratha Wars. India, in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a hotbed of shifting power. The Mughals were the dominant empire, rich and powerful, but the Marathas rose as a formidable challenge. From 1680 to 1818, these two powers clashed in a grinding series of wars. At first, the Mughals used all of their resources to try to crush the Marathas, and for a while it looked like they may win. The Marathas were tough and well organized, and when Mughal dominance started to fade, they fought back furiously. By the late 18th century, the Marathas had become the dominant force in much of India. The conflict only ended when the British East India Company swept in, defeating the Marathas and ending their independence. For over 130 years, Mughal and Maratha ambitions collided, leaving behind a fractured India that was ripe for colonial conquest. 10. Italian Wars. The Italian Wars were a sprawling series of conflicts that stretched across much of Europe, but their heart was in the wealthy Italian city-states. France and Spain were the main contenders, each wanting to dominate Italy's riches, though nearly every major European power got involved at some point, including the Holy Roman Empire, England, and the papacy. For over 6 decades, Italy became the battleground of Europe. Famous events included the sack of Rome in 1527 and shifting alliances that saw yesterday's enemies become today's allies. What makes this conflict remarkable is how long it dragged on, reshaping the balance of power in Europe. By the end, Spain emerged as the dominant force in Italy, while France had to lick its wounds. These wars weren't just about who ruled Naples or Milan, they were about who would lead Europe into the modern age. 9. Guatemalan Maya resistance. When the Spanish conquered much of Central America in the early 1500s, they assumed the Maya would fall quickly too. They were wrong. The Maya resisted Spanish rule for over 170 years. While the Spanish managed to subjugate parts of the region, independent Maya states in the jungles of Guatemala and the Yucatan held out. Guerrilla warfare, difficult terrain, and sheer determination kept them free. It wasn't until 1697 that the last major Maya city, Payasal, finally fell to Spanish forces. Even then, the resistance didn't fully vanish. Maya communities continued to resist colonial pressures in subtler ways for centuries more, but the formal military struggle lasted nearly 200 years. This long fight is a reminder that conquest wasn't always swift or total. Sometimes indigenous resistance stretched across generations, forcing empires to pour endless resources into wars they assumed would be quick. 8. Second Hundred Years' War. Historians sometimes call the long rivalry between England, later Britain, and France from 1689 to 1815 the Second Hundred Years' War. Unlike the medieval conflict, this one spanned the age of colonies and global empires. From the 9 Years' War in the late 1600s through the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, Britain and France clashed almost non-stop. These conflicts weren't just in Europe. They also happened in North America, the Caribbean, India, and Africa. This huge battle includes the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and finally, Waterloo. At its heart, it was about which power would rule the world. Britain's navy eventually tipped the balance, and by 1815, with Napoleon defeated, Britain stood as the world's leading empire. This rivalry shaped modern geopolitics, proving that, even across centuries, the same two neighbors could never stop throwing punches. 7. German-Polish Wars. For more than 2 centuries, the German states in the Polish Piast dynasty clashed over borders, influence, and power in Central Europe. Starting around the year 1000, these battles included changing alliances, raids, and big campaigns. The Holy Roman Empire tried to take control of Poland at times, but Polish leaders fought back to protect their independence and gain more power. The wars weren't constant, but came in repeated waves that scarred the frontier regions. One of the pivotal moments came in the early 13th century, when Poland also faced the devastating Mongol invasions, which complicated its struggles against German states. By 1241, the dynamic had shifted, but the long centuries of fighting had left their mark. This prolonged rivalry showed how deeply entangled medieval Europe was, with faith, feudalism, and ambition all driving conflicts that seemed impossible to finally settle. 6. Berber-Portuguese conflicts in Morocco. In 1415, Portugal captured Ceuta in North Africa, which led to more than 300 years of fighting with Berber and Moroccan forces. This was the start of Portugal's period of discovery, but it cost a lot of money. The Berbers fought back hard, which led to hundreds of years of raids, sieges, and wars along Morocco's coast. Portuguese forts dotted the shore, but each one became a flashpoint for resistance. Over time, Portugal's grip on Morocco weakened. Morocco steadily took land back. In 1769, the Portuguese were forced to surrender their final bastion at Mazagan, effectively ending their protracted battle. This was more than a minor incident during the Age of Discovery. It influenced how Portugal expanded its empire and demonstrated the inadequacy of European dominance over Africa. Morocco demonstrated that it was not an easy prize for about 350 years, making the battle one of the longest in colonial history. 5. Chichimeca War. The Chichimeca War started in 1550 when Spanish colonists moved into the deserts of northern Mexico and met severe resistance from the natives. The Chichimeca were not a single nation. They were a bunch of folks who moved around a lot and couldn't be controlled. For almost 200 years, they used guerrilla methods to fight, attacking Spanish caravans and stealing from towns. Spain put a lot of money and soldiers into the fight, building forts and sending warriors. But the Chichimeca wouldn't give up. In the end, the Spanish understood that they couldn't prevail by force. Instead, they changed their minds and offered land, food, and tools in exchange for peace. By the middle of the 18th century, the fighting had mostly stopped, but only after almost 200 years of war and talks. The Chichimeca War showed that even a large empire like Spain could be defeated by a small group of people who fought back, especially if they were on the ground. 4. Mamluk Mongol Ottoman Conflicts. When the Mongols surged into the Middle East in the 13th century, they met their match in the Mamluks of Egypt. The battle at Ain Jalut in 1260 is famous because the Mongols seemed unbeatable, but the Mamluks shattered that spell. Then, a long, complicated fight began. The Mongols never gave up completely, and the Mamluks fought for hundreds of years to keep their land in Egypt and Syria. Then, the Ottomans came, wanting to build an empire. By the late 15th century, the Ottomans were flexing hard, clashing with the Mamluks in a rivalry that simmered until the big blowout in 1517. The Ottomans crushed the Mamluks, folded Egypt into their empire, and became the new heavyweight of the region. From Mongols to Mamluks to Ottomans, this conflict stretched more than 250 years, a revolving door of empires, each trying to outmuscle the last. 3. Khmer Vietnamese Wars. Southeast Asia had its own centuries-long grind, with Cambodia's Khmer kingdom locked in a losing tug-of-war against expanding Vietnamese states. Starting around 1620, the Vietnamese southward push, or Nam Tien, pressed into Khmer territory. The fighting rolled on for over 2 centuries, with Vietnam slowly but surely chipping away at Cambodia's land and autonomy. It wasn't just Cambodia versus Vietnam either. Siam, Thailand, got involved too, making the whole situation even messier. By the mid-19th century, Cambodia was battered and weakened, caught between its two powerful neighbors. In 1847, things settled into an uneasy balance, but by then, much of the damage was done. Cambodia's sovereignty had been eroded, setting the stage for later colonial entanglements. This war didn't get the flashy battles of European rivalries, but in sheer endurance and impact on a nation's survival, it more than earns its place on this list. 2. Franco-Moorish Wars in North Africa. When people think of North African wars with Europeans, they picture Spain or Portugal. But France had its own century-spanning conflicts with the Moorish powers of the Maghreb. Starting in the early 1400s, French ships and soldiers clashed with corsairs from Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco. It was part piracy war, part trade war, and part outright colonial ambition. Moorish fleets struck French shipping, while French expeditions tried to shut them down. Every time it seemed settled, raids and reprisals reignited the fighting. This back and forth went on for hundreds of years, right into the 1700s. France eventually expanded into North Africa in the 19th century, but only after centuries of attritional conflict softened the ground. The Franco-Moorish Wars weren't a single campaign, but a constant low-burn fight, shaping Mediterranean politics and commerce for generations, long before full-blown colonization. 1. Sami Scandinavian Conflicts. Far up in the Arctic Circle, another long war was unfolding. Not big-pitched battles, but centuries of resistance. The Sami people who are native to the area fought to keep their country, while Swedish, Norwegian, and Russian powers slowly moved north. From the 1200s to the 1700s, this fight took the form of raids, conflicts, and constant pressure on the Sami way of life. It wasn't a formal war in the usual sense, but it was a fight that lasted for 500 years. By the 18th century, the Sami had mostly been defeated, and their lands were taken over by the expanding Scandinavian powers. Yet their culture endured, even under enormous strain. This long resistance shows that war doesn't always mean castles and cannons. Sometimes it's an ongoing fight for survival at the edges of the empire, lasting for centuries in the harshest landscapes Europe had to offer. And that's all I have for you today. But how about some bonus trivia? The longest war in history is believed to be the Reconquista, which lasted for about 781 years. And, well, now that's it for today. But wait, actually, you know what? I do have some shocking facts that the government doesn't want you to know. So, check out that video here. And as always, like I said, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, press the notification bell, and I'll catch you guys real soon. See ya.